had been fighting a serious private health condition away from public child of Prince William and Princess Catherine. View. Now, after weeks of
The statement came late at night without fanfare, but it landed on the palace like a held breath finally released. Prince Rowan, the youngest child of Crown Prince Alastair and Princess Mireille of Averlin, had been living with a serious illness the public never knew about. After months of careful silence, the royal house of Averlin confirmed that his treatment would continue, and that he would step back from every public duty. Behind that short, formal sentence stood two exhausted parents and a small boy who had been carrying more than anyone realized. Before we go further into what this really meant for the family, if stories like this pull you in, stick around because what happened next inside those walls tells you everything about what a crown is actually worth. The palace's statement said only that Rowan was receiving specialist care for a condition affecting his strength and energy, and that doctors had asked for time. It did not mention the fevers that came without warning, or the afternoons when the boy simply could not lift his head from the pillow. It did not mention the meetings, the arguments, or the fear that had quietly reshaped an entire household. Prince Alastair was standing in a side room of Ashwick Hall, the family's private retreat outside the capital, when an aide brought him the final draft of the announcement. He read the line about his son's withdrawal from public life once, then a second time, and his hand pressed flat against the desk as though the wood itself needed steadying. He had weathered political pressure, family disagreements, and the slow, constant weight of knowing he would one day wear the crown. None of it had prepared him to put his signature under a sentence that made his child's suffering official. Princess Mireille stood near the window and watched him without a word. Part of her felt relief because the long effort of hiding things was finally over. But the relief carried its own guilt. Once the statement went out, her son's illness would stop being a private matter between four walls. It would belong to newspapers, to strangers, to people who had never met him and would still feel entitled to an opinion about his body. She crossed the room, put her hand over her husband's, and only then did he pick up the pen. He signed as a future king. Inside he still felt only like a father who wanted to take the whole thing back. What the announcement didn't say was that the household had already imposed a strict new rule days earlier. No one was to discuss where Rowan's treatment was taking place, not even among trusted staff. That single instruction revealed a fear deeper than the illness itself. Someone close to the family might already have tried to learn more about the boy's condition than they had any right to know. As the news reached the wider court, King Edmund, Alastair's father and the reigning monarch, sent word that he wanted to see his son immediately. The message gave no explanation. It simply asked for his presence, alone. To the public, Rowan had always been the easy one. Restless, funny, impossible to keep still during long ceremonies. Inside the family, that same restlessness had slowly become something everyone watched with a kind of quiet dread. A skipped meal. A nap that lasted too long. A silence where there should have been noise. Alastair and Mireille weren't only trying to shield a child from cameras. They were trying to protect the last stretch of his childhood from a truth that had already rearranged their lives. Mireille had spent weeks rebuilding the family's routine so it wouldn't feel like a routine built around sickness. She moved appointments quietly, protected his rest without naming it as rest, and kept his older siblings' school schedules exactly as they'd always been. She understood why that mattered. If the whole house began to orbit his illness, Rowan might start to believe the illness was all he was. But every bit of normal life she preserved required another small secret, another rearranged plan, another half-answer to a child too observant not to notice. One evening, Rowan watched a doctor step into the private wing and felt the usual hush fall over the room. Afterward, he asked his mother why the grown-ups always went quiet when the doctors arrived. She knelt down, kept her voice even, and told him it was because everyone was listening carefully, not because anyone had given up hope. He accepted the answer. She carried the weight of the question long after he'd gone back to his books. The guilt didn't leave her. She replayed the tired afternoons, the meals he'd pushed away, wondering if she'd missed something sooner. Doctors kept telling her the early symptoms had been easy to overlook, that they mimicked ordinary childhood exhaustion. The reassurance never fully quieted the fear that a mother should have known first. Alastair carried the same fear differently. He turned it into control, pushing back against advisors who kept placing state briefings in front of him while his son was mid-treatment. He understood the importance of his duties. He no longer accepted that every one of them outranked his son's health. His older children noticed everything. His daughter, Princess Odile, began quietly checking whether Rowan had eaten, sitting with him through the harder evenings. His elder son, Prince Julian, lingered by doorways, catching pieces of conversations meant to stay hidden. One night Odile asked her father plainly whether her brother would be sick forever. Alistair opened his mouth and found no answer waiting. That silence changed something in Mireille. She began to wonder whether one particular public appearance months earlier had cost her son more than anyone admitted, and why the palace had worked so hard to keep that day out of the official record. That appearance had been a formal harvest ceremony, the kind of event the crown rarely skips. Rowan had insisted he felt well enough to attend, and everyone around him had wanted badly to believe it. Behind the scenes, though, his condition had already begun sliding. The ceremony itself passed without incident, and for a few hours the family let themselves hope the worst had passed. Then, in a quiet corridor afterward, Rowan reached for his father's sleeve and said very softly that his legs didn't feel right. He collapsed before they reached the car. Alistair caught him a half-second too late to stop the fall completely, dropped to the floor beside him and called his name over and over while the boy's response grew fainter. Mireille took charge of the scene with a steadiness that frightened her afterward more than it comforted anyone at the time, clearing the corridor, demanding the household physician immediately, her voice never once cracking even as terror moved plainly across her face. King Edmund had urged the couple, once the incident became known within the household, to release a short statement rather than risk speculation if anyone had witnessed the collapse. Alistair refused. He told his father that his son deserved an actual diagnosis before the institution turned his illness into a press release. Specialists eventually traced the collapse to an underlying condition that attacked his strength in sudden, unpredictable waves. The answer brought relief. It also confirmed the danger had been real, not imagined. Then came the second blow. A private file describing that corridor incident disappeared from a restricted archive meant to be accessible only to a handful of senior staff. Nothing leaked to the press, but Alistair understood exactly what the disappearance meant. Someone inside the palace's own structure had tried to reach information about his son that was never meant to be theirs. When Alistair finally sat down with his father, it wasn't the conversation of an obedient heir meeting his king. It was two men, one defending the institution he'd inherited, the other defending a child he refused to let become an institutional detail. Alistair placed a copied access log on the table between them, showing exactly who had entered the restricted file and when. Edmund read it in silence long enough that the room itself seemed to shrink. Alistair didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He told his father that the palace had protected its own procedures more carefully than it had protected his son. The investigation that followed traced the breach to a junior official who had acted on an informal request from an office aligned with the wider royal household, not, as it turned out, from the king himself. Edmund's shock was genuine and Alistair believed it. The suspicion moved off his father and settled somewhere deeper inside the palace machinery. Edmund dismissed the responsible official immediately and, breaking sharply from long-standing practice, personally restricted access to every medical record concerning his grandchildren. Before the wider family could fully settle the matter, Rowan asked to speak with his father alone. No advisors. No draft statements waiting for approval. Just a boy, still recovering, with a single question that reframed everything the adults had been fighting about. He didn't ask about the missing file or the cancelled appearances. He asked whether his illness was the reason everyone kept being angry with each other. Alistair took his son's hand and told him the truth, that the anger belonged entirely to the grown-ups, born from fear, not from anything Rowan had done. The boy said simply that he didn't want his sister crying anymore, and he didn't want his brother staying awake outside his door at night out of worry. That was the moment that changed his father completely. Alistair had spent weeks believing that protecting his son meant controlling every variable, confronting every failure, preparing for every possible threat. He finally understood that Rowan didn't need a father consumed by blame. He needed one who could simply sit beside him without turning every quiet evening into another battle. In the end, King Edmund gathered the family, not for another inquiry but for one final decision. He confirmed that Rowan would remain free of any royal duty until his parents and his doctors agreed it was safe, with no fixed date attached to that promise. He approved permanent privacy protections covering his grandchildren's medical care, education, and daily life, and he removed Rowan's name from the ceremonial schedule himself, replacing it on a private family calendar with 2 words: home and recovery. Princess Mireille finally allowed herself to set down the guilt she'd carried since the corridor collapse. She hadn't missed the signs. She had questioned them, chased answers, and protected her son long before anyone had proof he needed protecting. Her fear had never been weakness. It had been love that refused to look away. Prince Rowan's illness changed the House of Averlin because it forced a family, and eventually a crown, to remember something tradition had quietly let slip. A royal child is a child first. His courage never needed an audience. It lived in the small, hard moments nobody photographed, the honest questions, the difficult treatments, and the quiet love he kept offering a family fighting a battle he never chose to be part of. There would be no grand return, no staged appearance to prove anything to anyone. Rowan would simply be allowed to heal, surrounded not by expectation, but by a family that had finally chosen him over the crown.